Lastly, but not leastly, we have the large intestine. And the large intestine is that horseshoe-shaped organ that frames the small intestine and is about 4.9 feet long, about 3 inches in diameter. And it's going to prepare indigestible materials and waste to be excreted. And a lot of that preparation is going to be the resorption of water. So while feces themselves contain about 75% water, by this time they're dehydrated into this thick paste. And that paste is what eventually will be defecated out as feces. We also have some absorption of some important vitamins, and these vitamins will be produced by bacteria that reside in the large intestine. And these bacteria are actually very important. Without them, people would die. So these bacteria can produce things such as vitamin K, which is an important clotting element. We've got biotin, and we also have vitamin B5, which is important for some production of steroids. All right, we have 3 major parts of the large intestine. The cecum, which is the part that's going to receive the contents from the ileum, and those contents will pass through a small smooth muscle ring called the ileocecal sphincter, and that will open up in little waves throughout the day, passing small amounts of material from the ileum to the cecum. And it's a slow process, as it takes a long time for stuff to travel through the small intestine. It also takes a long time for this dehydration and compaction process of the waste materials in the large intestine. So the cecum is that first portion, and material from the cecum will then be passed on to the colon, which has 4 major parts: the ascending colon, the transverse colon, the descending colon, the sigmoid colon, and finally that will lead into the rectum, which will end in the anus. So the last 6 inches of the digestive tract is the rectum. The cecum, as we've already said, is going to receive the material from the ileum, and it also has attached to it the vermiform appendix. And the vermiform appendix, as you recall, is a collection of lymphoid nodules, so it's a lymphatic organ. Sometimes it can become inflamed, something can get in it, or something can cause it to be inflamed, and it has to be removed. This is a procedure that was done routinely in the 50s and 60s and even in the 70s whenever someone was undergoing abdominal surgery, because of the fact that it would sometimes be prone to getting inflamed. Nowadays, physicians don't remove it simply because its function as a lymphoid organ is now much better understood. The colon is got the presence of these haustra, which are the characteristic appearance of the colon, and that are these little pouch-like things in series that make up the wall of the colon. So all along the colon, we see these little segmented bits that are basically just where the wall has sort of tightened in. And the reason that the wall kind of tightens up into these little haustra or pouches is that we've got an arrangement of the smooth muscle that's a little bit different from in other parts of the intestinal tract. So the muscularis externa of the colon has the normal inner circular layer, but the outer longitudinal layer is now reduced to this thin band of smooth muscle. So we've got these 3 longitudinal bands sort of sitting together of smooth muscle called the tinea coli. And these are going to take the place of the outer layer of the muscularis externa. And it's the muscle tone in these tinea coli that create the crinkling in the wall of the colon, which create the haustra. And we'll see that contents within the colon are often sort of churned back and forth in sort of segmentation between the haustra, and that just helps in the reabsorption of water and the compaction process a little bit. We also have a characteristic of the serosa of the colon, and that we have these little fatty appendices that are found within the serosa of the colon. The 4 regions of the colon, as we've mentioned before, are the ascending, transverse, descending, and sigmoid. As you recall, the ascending and descending colon are both retroperitoneal. The transverse colon is suspended within the transverse mesocolon, while the sigmoid colon is suspended in the sigmoid mesocolon. Both of those were mesentery. All right, so here's the picture from the book. And for whatever reason, the slide for the colon just disappeared. I'm really not sure why. Must be Gremlins got it. Sometimes I think Gremlins rearrange my slides too. So I just include the picture from the book. So here you can see it quite nicely. You can see the ileum, which is that last segment. It's actually the longest segment of the small intestine, but the last part of the ileum empties right into the cecum through this ileocecal valve, which is a sphincter, a smooth muscle sphincter. And when you have distension and contractions of the stomach and the duodenum, then you're going to have some signals to move material through the small intestine and through the large intestine as well. From here, from the cecum, we can look inside and you can actually see the ileocecal valve. You can also see the appendix hanging off of the cecum here. But from the cecum, that material will then travel into the colon, starting at the ascending colon. Here we can see our Taenia coli, which are those bands of smooth muscle. So there are 3 bands of smooth muscle that run longitudinally that make this sort of larger aggregate band of the smooth muscle called the Taenia coli. And you can see the fatty appendices in the serosa as well. You can also see the haustra, which basically are where the walls of the colon are kind of tightened in. And that comes from muscle tone in the Taenia coli. And that create these haustra by sort of tightening the lumen inside and tightening the whole wall of the thing. We're also going to see that we've got our sigmoid colon is going to lead into the rectum, which is the last part of the digestive or the large intestine and thus the digestive tract. And the rectum is where we're going to see our transition from our simple columnar epithelium back to our stratified squamous epithelium. Because as you can imagine, with the passing of fecal matter through here, it's going to see quite a bit of abrasion. We'll also see these folds within here called anal columns that we'll see at the distal end of the anal canal. We'll see that we have an inner circular layer of smooth muscle that's going to create the internal anal sphincter, and we have an outer layer, external layer of skeletal muscle that will create the external anal sphincter. And when the defecation reflex is triggered, we will see the interplay between these 2 groups of muscles will lead to defecation. As to blood supply, we're going to get some inflow of blood via the superior and inferior mesenteric arteries, and we're going to collect blood. Blood will drain from the large intestine via the superior and inferior mesenteric veins. This next slide here just shows a close-up of the rectum and the anus. So the rectum is going to be where we're transitioning back to that stratified squamous epithelium, which is very important because the anus is going to see quite a bit of abrasion through the passage of this fecal matter. We can see here a characteristic distinct of the rectum, and that's these anal canals that form as folds of the mucosa here. We're also going to see that we've got those 2 sets of muscles that we talked about earlier, our internal anal sphincter and our external anal sphincter. The internal sphincter is smooth muscle and under involuntary control, while the external sphincter is going to be under voluntary control. And we will see that during the defecation reflex, the internal anal sphincter will relax and the external anal sphincter will be involuntarily contracted, and the person will have to voluntarily relax it in order to complete the defecation. All right, so now that we've looked at sort of the gross anatomy of the large intestine, let's look at the histology of it. One of the things we'll notice is that we have no villi in here. We have very deep intestinal crypts that are going to be making mucus cells, but we're not going to be making any enzymes in here. In fact, we have done most of our digestion at higher levels of the GI tract. The only digestion that's going to be done from here on out will be done by bacteria that reside within the large intestine. So this is an important distinction. So we'll see that most of the job at this point of the crypts are to create lots of mucus so that we can provide the lubrication necessary for moving this fecal matter through. If for whatever reason you get too much tightening of those haustra, then you can have a bulge in the wall called the diverticula. And if you have something called diverticulitis, this could actually become life-threatening, as that could rupture and then lead to a leakage of this material into the abdominal cavity, which would be quite problematic. We have some lymphoid nodules that are scattered throughout the mucosa here, the lamina propria and the submucosa in the large intestine. And as we've already seen before, the external muscularis externa, the longitudinal layer is now reduced to those 3 bands of the Taenia coli. Here's a picture of it. Here we can see that it's flat here. We don't see villi. We don't see plicae circularis. We see just these really deep intestinal crypts, which are going to make lots and lots of mucus. Here's an aggregated lymphoid nodule. Here's our muscularis externa, and you can see our circular layer here. And then our longitudinal layer is really these Taenia coli here. All right, we look deep into these crypts. This is an actual slide of it. You can see all these goblet cells in here. All right, some of the things that are absorbed and produced in the large intestine. Now, these are actually produced by bacteria. We've got 3 important vitamins. We've got vitamin K, and this is going to be important to produce clotting factors. So we're going to have prothrombin is going to be reliant on the presence of vitamin K. And without vitamin K, the liver cannot synthesize these clotting factors. We've got biotin, which is a water-soluble molecule. It's going to be important for glucose metabolism. And we've got our vitamin B5, which is also water-soluble. That's going to be required in the manufacture of certain steroid hormones and neurotransmitters. Now, vitamin K, interestingly, is a fat-soluble vitamin. And we have 4 major fat-soluble vitamins that we need to be aware of: A, D, E, and K. And this becomes important because if for whatever reason you don't have enough lipid in your diet, then you will have a dearth of these vitamins, and then you can have some problems that come from lack of these vitamins. All right, as we said before, less than 10% of the nutrient absorption occurs in the large intestine. We'll mainly be resorbing water. We're going to be resorbing some bile salts in the cecum, and we're going to be absorbing these vitamins that are produced by bacteria and some organic wastes. Some of these organic wastes will come from the conversion of bilirubin to what we call urobilinogens and stercobilinogens. Some urobilinogens will be floating around the bloodstream, and these will be excreted by the urinary system. The urobilinogens and stercobilinogens that are in the colon will be converted to urobilins and stercobilins by exposure to oxygen and the activity of bacteria. And these urobilins and stercobilins are going to give feces the color that they have when they're excreted. Other things we're going to break down are amino acids, the individual amino acid monomers. And as you recall, one end of the amino acid is an amino group, which is a nitrogen with 2 hydrogens on it. So we're going to have some ammonia that's being generated as a breakdown product, and we'll also have some nitrogen-containing compounds that give feces a particular odor, and these are called indole and skatole. We also have hydrogen sulfide, which is the typical rotten egg smell sometimes that you will get when someone has flatulence. And flatulence is basically, the colloquial term is farting. And what will happen in flatulence is you will have some carbohydrates, complex carbohydrates, that are indigestible by you. You don't have the enzymes for it. But the bacteria in your large intestine do. And they will break down these large complex carbohydrates that you can't. And as a byproduct of that, they'll produce a flatus, which is intestinal gas. And that's what builds up in the large intestine and creates flatulence. And this is the kind of thing that you might see after eating beans or other types of legumes and beans that contain these indigestible complex carbohydrates. So we have a lot of movement within the large intestine, so it's very slow. Because most of it, you have movement from the cecum to the transverse colon is slow so that you can have lots of water absorption. But occasionally you're going to have these peristaltic waves that are going to move materials along the length of the colon. You also have some segmentation movements called haustral churning, where you're moving the contents back and forth between adjacent haustra. And then occasionally you'll have these things called mass movements, which are these large peristaltic waves that happen, once or twice a day, that are going to move the contents of the large intestine down into the rectum. And the rectum usually stays empty. And once it gets filled, that's going to trigger the defecation reflex. And we're going to have 2 positive feedback loops here, a short loop and a long loop. And both of them will be triggered by distension of the walls of the rectum. So the upshot of these reflexes is that you're going to have both a local reflex that's going to cause local peristalsis within the distal sigmoid colon and the rectum, and you're also going to have a longer reflex mediated through the parasympathetic nervous system that's going to increase peristalsis throughout the rest of the entire large intestine. The other thing that's going to happen is you're going to have a somatic reflex that's going to close the external anal sphincter. The local reflex that mediated the increased peristalsis within the rectum will also involuntarily open that smooth muscle internal anal sphincter, but the somatic reflex will close the external anal sphincter, and that is going to require the person to make a conscious effort in order to open the external anal sphincter and then allow the defecation to occur.